Welcome to Narrative Nights. Step into a world of mystery, intrigue, and suspense. At Narrative Nights, we bring you thrilling detective stories that will challenge your mind and keep you guessing until the very end. Before we begin, we'd love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from? Drop a comment and let us know which part of the globe you're watching from. We're all united by the love of a good mystery. Let the investigation begin.
Miss Marple and the Melody of Murder. Chapter 1. The Gathering at Ashworth Manor. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cosy cottage in St. Mary Mead, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she read the letter that had arrived earlier that day. The writing was elegant and deliberate, unmistakably from Lady Eleanor Danforth, an old friend whom she hadn't seen in many years. The slanted, careful script seemed to convey not only a message, but an emotion, subtle, yet tinged with something more. My dear Jane, it has been far too long since we last met, and I hope this letter finds you well. Sir Reginald is hosting one of his infamous dinner parties this Friday at Ashworth Manor, and we would be thrilled if you could join us. The gathering will be small, nothing too tiresome, I assure you. Sir Reginald's nephew, Henry, will be there, as well as Mr. Weston, his solicitor, and Bernard Hale, the pianist. You may recall him, a difficult man, but brilliant in his way. His secretary, a rather solemn fellow named Oliver Graves, will also attend. He gives me the chills, though I dare say that's just my nerves. I know you, Jane. You possess a rare instinct for seeing things as they truly are, and I must confess, though I may be overreacting, I feel something is not quite right at the manor lately. Sir Reginald has been hinting at revising his will once more, which, as you can imagine, has stirred quite a bit of tension in the household. I would feel far more at ease if you could join us. With kindest regards, Eleanor. Miss Marple read the letter twice. Something in Eleanor's tone unsettled her. The invitation itself was polite and typical, but the underlying hint of unease was unmistakable. Lady Eleanor was no nervous type, her composure was legendary. So for her to express such a sentiment in this way meant something was afoot. She was well acquainted with Sir Reginald Ashworth, even if they had only met a few times. He was a man of great wealth and even greater ego, known for his rigid routines and volatile temper. A talented pianist in his youth, he had since become infamous for his cruelty to those who failed to meet his lofty standards. His reputation as a tyrant in both business and personal matters was widely known. Yet, he also enjoyed the social spotlight, never hesitating to host grand soirees when it suited his purposes. The mention of a will, however, intrigued Miss Marple. A will, particularly one under revision, was always a source of tension, often revealing the darker side of human nature. Greed, envy, and old grudges would emerge when it came to matters of inheritance. These things often ended poorly, Miss Marple reflected. With a decisive nod, she folded the letter neatly and placed it in the drawer of her writing desk. Her decision was made. She would attend the gathering at Ashworth Manor. The journey to Ashworth Manor was not a long one, but it gave Miss Marple ample time to reflect on the possible motives of the invited guests. Sir Reginald had carefully curated the list, she imagined, but perhaps not with the comfort of his guests in mind. His nephew Henry would likely have strong opinions about the changes to the will. Mr. Weston, the solicitor, would probably tread carefully around the subject, avoiding any direct mention of the will's contents. Bernard Hale, once a rising star in the musical world, was now a faded figure, perhaps out of the limelight, but still retaining a sharpness that made him difficult to ignore. And then there was Oliver Graves, the secretary. Eleanor had described him as someone who gave her the chills. Secretaries often held the key to more than one might assume. They were the silent observers, privy to every conversation and correspondence, and yet, they often went unnoticed. Miss Marple knew from experience that those who were overlooked often had the most to hide. As the car climbed the long drive leading to the grand Ashworth manor, Miss Marple allowed herself a wry smile. It was, she thought, the perfect setting for a mystery. Ashworth Manor stood tall and imposing, its Georgian architecture casting long shadows in the evening light. The butler greeted her with the quiet grace of a man accustomed to perfection. Inside, the drawing room was warmly lit, and the guests were already gathered. Lady Eleanor, elegant as always but with a trace of tension in her posture, greeted Miss Marple warmly. "Jane, my dear, how wonderful to see you again," she exclaimed, her smile tinged with something that did not quite reach her eyes. Sir Reginald, seated by the fireplace, gave a brief nod in acknowledgement. He was a lean, grey-haired man with sharp eyes that seemed to assess everything around him. His voice was deep and commanding when he spoke. "Miss Marple, I presume? Eleanor speaks highly of you. I trust you're not entirely a stranger to music." Miss Marple, ever composed, smiled demurely. "Oh, I have a great fondness for it, though my musical experience is mostly limited to village choirs and concerts." Sir Reginald let out a dry laugh. "Ah, well, let us hope your ears are better suited for more than just music tonight." His words were seemingly light, but Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder, was that a mere remark, or was it a warning? She studied him carefully, noting the sharpness in his eyes, the restlessness in his movements. The evening had begun, and Miss Marple could already feel the tension simmering beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary gathering. The question on her mind was simple: what, if anything, was Sir Reginald Ashworth hiding? Chapter 2: The Silent Tensions. Dinner at Ashworth Manor was an elegant affair, set in the grand dining hall of the old Georgian estate. The high, vaulted ceilings and soft glow of candlelight lent the room an air of refinement, yet beneath the polished surface of the evening, there was a distinct chill. The warm glow from the flickering candles seemed to do little to dispel the tension that hung in the air like an unspoken agreement among the guests. What should have been a gracious gathering felt strangely uncomfortable, as though the guests were all bound by a shared, unacknowledged discomfort. Seated at Lady Eleanor Danforth's right, Miss Marple watched the scene unfold with the keen eyes of a seasoned observer. Age had bestowed upon her the gift of patience, the ability to sit quietly, listen attentively, and unravel the mysteries of human nature as though they were a tangled ball of yarn. The evening was no different. The moment she had set foot in Ashworth Manor, she had known that something was amiss, and now, as the dinner progressed, her suspicions deepened. At the head of the table, Sir Reginald Ashworth sat with an air of imperious authority, his silver hair combed back with the precision of a man who had spent years honing his image. Despite his advancing age, there was still a sharpness to his features, a rigid formality to his posture. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried the weight of command, and his guests listened, sometimes with deference, sometimes with barely concealed disdain. Lady Ashworth, seated beside him, maintained the appearance of a woman accustomed to the rigors of high society. Her beauty, once striking, had long since been dulled by time and disappointment. Her face was smooth, but her eyes held the unmistakable weariness of a woman who had lived with a man like Sir Reginald for far too long. Her grip on her knife and fork was precise, but there was a tension in her movements, as if each bite was a reminder of the unspoken words she dared not speak. At the far end of the table sat Henry Ashworth, Sir Reginald's nephew. In his early 30s, Henry was the kind of man who had relied on his charm to navigate life, his good looks and easy smile often enough to smooth over any rough edges. But tonight, there was an unmistakable edge to his demeanor. His handsome face was set in a permanent scowl, his eyes flickering with irritation as they repeatedly landed on Sir Reginald. When he spoke, his voice carried a trace of frustration, though he made an effort to mask it. Bernard Hale, the pianist, was a figure of brooding intensity. Miss Marple had not seen him in years, but his presence had not changed. Once a musical prodigy, Hale had aged into a man whose every movement seemed deliberate, almost theatrical, as if he were forever performing to an unseen audience. His eyes, however, spoke of bitterness and regret, and his interactions with Sir Reginald were marked by an undercurrent of resentment. It was clear that there was a history between them, one that had not been fully resolved. Mr. Weston, the solicitor, was the most nervous of the group. Neat and efficient, he kept his eyes trained on his plate, barely making a sound unless spoken to. He seemed distinctly uncomfortable with the subject of inheritance, which was brought up more than once during the meal. His attempts to avoid any direct discussion about Sir Reginald's intentions were palpable, but Miss Marple knew that there was more to his unease than mere professional decorum. Then there was Oliver Graves, the secretary. He was a quiet man, almost invisible, who spoke only when spoken to. His voice was soft, measured, and when he did speak, it was with an air of studied neutrality. But Miss Marple was not fooled. Graves may have appeared to be a mere observer in the room, but his dark, watchful eyes missed nothing. There was a certain knowledge in them, a quiet awareness that suggested he was privy to more than anyone else realized. As the meal continued, Miss Marple observed the interplay between these figures, silently piecing together the relationships and tensions that simmered beneath the surface. The conversations, though polite, felt stiff and strained, with each person trying, in their own way, to navigate the minefield of emotions and unspoken agendas that filled the room. It was during the main course that Sir Reginald finally spoke, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. He set his wine glass down with a deliberate clink, drawing the attention of everyone at the table. "Well," he said, his voice calm but laced with a subtle authority, "since so many of you seem to be dancing around the subject, I think it's time to address it. I intend to finalize my new will within the next week." The room fell silent. It was as if time itself had stopped. Miss Marple watched as the faces around the table froze, their reactions a mix of surprise, suspicion, and barely concealed anxiety. Mr. Weston, ever the professional, cleared his throat, his discomfort palpable. Lady Ashworth's fork scraped loudly against her plate as she tightened her grip on it. Henry's face darkened, and he leaned forward slightly, his voice tight with tension. "I see," he said, his tone careful but edged with resentment. "And what changes might we expect?" Sir Reginald's lips curved into a slow, mirthless smile. "That, my dear boy, is none of your concern." Henry's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. Bernard Hale, who had been silent up until that point, let out a soft, almost derisive chuckle. "And what about you, Bernard?" Sir Reginald continued, his attention shifting to the pianist. "No biting remarks tonight." Bernard's fingers tapped idly against his wine glass, his eyes narrowing. "Oh, I learned long ago that some battles aren't worth fighting," he said, his voice carrying a trace of bitterness. "You've won your victories, Reginald. Perhaps it's best we leave it at that." Sir Reginald's smile tightened. A gracious sentiment, if somewhat uncharacteristic. Miss Marple observed closely as Bernard's fingers tightened around his glass. Whatever history existed between him and Sir Reginald, it was clear that it was not a matter that had been fully settled. The conversation continued, but the mood in the room remained tense, the air thick with unspoken words. When the final course was served, Sir Reginald dabbed his lips with his napkin and stood, his movements measured and deliberate. "I think I'll retire to my music room," he announced, his tone final. "A nocturne is the perfect way to end an evening." Lady Ashworth let out a barely audible sigh of relief, her shoulders relaxing as though the weight of the evening had finally lifted. Bernard Hale, however, remained still, his lips curling into a thin smile. "Still clinging to old habits, I see," he mused, his voice low. "You've always had a peculiar fondness for that nocturne of yours." Sir Reginald's gaze was cold as he fixed Bernard with a stare. "Some things," he said, his voice icy, "are timeless." Miss Marple watched as he left the room, his footsteps echoing in the quiet stillness. The moment he was gone, the atmosphere in the dining room shifted. The tension that had gripped the room began to ease, albeit slightly. Lady Ashworth, her shoulders no longer so rigid, allowed herself a small sigh of relief. Henry, who had been simmering with barely controlled frustration, poured himself another glass of wine, though his face was now a mask of unreadable emotions. Bernard Hale tapped his fingers idly against the table, lost in his own thoughts. Mr. Weston, now able to relax, finished his brandy with a quick, nervous glance at the others. And Miss Marple? She simply sat and observed. There was something in the air tonight, something that no one could name, but that each person felt. It was a sense of impending change, the calm before the storm. And as the first notes of Sir Reginald's nocturne began to drift through the halls of Ashworth Manor, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that she had walked into a house waiting for tragedy to strike. Chapter 3: A Note Left Unfinished. The air in Ashworth Manor was thick with tension, the grand halls and polished floors echoing the faint strains of music. The source was unmistakable: Sir Reginald Ashworth, at the grand piano, playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The piece was a delicate, intricate composition, the kind that demanded precision and control. Sir Reginald, ever the perfectionist, played it with the technical expertise of someone who had spent countless hours in solitude perfecting his craft. Yet, despite his remarkable skill, the music was devoid of any true warmth, as though it had been played by a machine rather than a man. Miss Marple, seated near Lady Eleanor Danforth in the drawing-room, allowed the music to wash over her. She had always appreciated the finer things in life, the intricacies of human behavior, the smallest gestures, and the way music could often reveal more than words ever could. Tonight, however, her mind wasn't focused on the music, it was on the people around her. The atmosphere in the room was stifled with something unspoken. Small talk filled the spaces between the notes of music, but it was clear that the guests were uneasy, their words mechanical and forced. Henry Ashworth, Sir Reginald's nephew, sat with his back against the plush armchair, his legs stretched out and his gaze fixed on the fire. His fingers drummed absent-mindedly against the armrest, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Bernard Hale, the once promising pianist turned brooding recluse, paced near the window, his lips pressed into a tight line. Miss Marple caught a glimpse of his restless movements, his mind clearly occupied with something troubling. Lady Ashworth, seated on the other side of Miss Marple, sat with the rigid posture of someone well practiced in the art of politeness, but her eyes told a different story. There was a distance in her gaze, a sort of detachment that suggested she was lost in thought, perhaps reflecting on the years she had spent beside Sir Reginald. Mr. Weston, the solicitor, seemed the most uncomfortable of all. His watch had been checked twice in the last 10 minutes, and he kept glancing nervously toward the door, as though waiting for some external distraction to relieve him from the oppressive silence. As Miss Marple surveyed the room, her mind worked in quiet observation. She knew that if she waited long enough, something would unfold. People couldn't hide their true selves forever. And tonight, she sensed that something was about to happen that would shed light on the unspoken tensions that filled the room. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the music stopped. It wasn't the natural conclusion of the piece. No, the sound simply cut off, one note half played, and then nothing. The silence that followed felt unnatural, like a void had opened, swallowing the last echo of the music. The guests in the room froze, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, instinctively aware that something was terribly wrong. Then, the piercing scream came. It was high-pitched, urgent, and filled with unmistakable terror. It rang through the hall, vibrating in the walls. Everyone in the drawing-room shot to their feet in a frantic rush. Lady Ashworth gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Henry was up so quickly that his chair toppled backward, but he barely noticed. Bernard Hale, his face now a mask of grim determination, headed straight for the hallway without a word. Miss Marple, calm as ever, placed her knitting neatly on the side table and followed the others. The source of the scream was unmistakable. It came from the music room at the far end of the corridor. The heavy oak doors were slightly ajar, and light spilled from within, casting a warm glow onto the polished wood floor of the hall. Inside the room stood Oliver Graves, the secretary. He was frozen in place in the doorway, his face so pale it seemed to reflect the light. His mouth opened and closed as if he were trying to speak, but no words came. Miss Marple stepped forward, her eyes taking in every detail with practiced precision. She could already sense that this was no ordinary event. Sir Reginald Ashworth was seated at the grand piano, his body slumped forward, his lifeless fingers resting awkwardly against the keys. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, his forehead pressed against the polished wood of the piano. The sheet music before him was torn slightly at the corner, as though he had clutched at it in his final moments. A chill ran through Miss Marple as she observed the scene. The grand clock in the hallway had stopped, its hands frozen at exactly 10 p.m. Mr. Weston was the first to speak, his voice hoarse and tentative. "A heart attack." Bernard Hale let out a short, mirthless laugh. "Convenient, isn't it?" Henry Ashworth stepped forward, his eyes searching the scene. "Is he?" Miss Marple moved closer, her sharp gaze scanning the room. She had seen death before, many times, and though she was not a doctor, she knew the signs. Something was off. The way Sir Reginald was positioned, it was too perfect. Too deliberate. A man who suffered a fatal attack at the piano would not slump so neatly, his body held upright in such a manner that his fingers remained poised against the keys. He would have collapsed, perhaps fallen sideways or onto the floor. This was not the way death took him. Her mind worked quickly, piecing together the details that didn't fit. The torn sheet music, the way it had been gripped so tightly, as though in desperation. The stopped clock, was it a coincidence, or had it been tampered with? And most telling of all, the expression frozen on Sir Reginald's face. It wasn't the peaceful calm of someone who had passed quietly. Nor was it the agony of pain. It was an expression of shock, of disbelief. A sense of horror began to settle over Miss Marple. This was not a natural death. This was murder. Oliver Graves, still paralyzed with fear, managed to find his voice. I only came to bring him his tea," he stammered. His hand trembled as he gestured weakly toward a small silver tray on a side table. The cup of tea remained untouched. I knocked, but he didn't answer. The music had stopped, so I thought. His voice trailed off, and he shuddered visibly. Henry Ashworth exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "We need to call the police." Bernard Hale, his face still locked in an unreadable expression, muttered, "Yes. Call them. Let them deal with this mess." Miss Marple, however, was already deep in thought. She had seen this before, a murder disguised as something else. She knew that the truth was hidden in the smallest of details, and she wasn't going to let it slip away unnoticed. Her gaze flickered over the room once more. The torn sheet music, the stopped clock, the way Sir Reginald's body had been arranged so carefully, these were not the hallmarks of a random death. Someone had staged this scene, and someone had intended for it to look like a natural occurrence. But why? Miss Marple moved closer, her sharp mind already piecing together the answers. It would take time, but she would find them. The answer was hidden in the details, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. The sound of the clock ticking echoed in the stillness as Miss Marple, with the quiet determination only she possessed, began to untangle the web of lies and secrets that had led to this moment. There was something about Sir Reginald's final moments, something that the murderer had overlooked. And Miss Marple was going to find it. Chapter 4: The Shadows of Deceit. Inspector Dermot Craddock arrived at Ashworth Manor with the calm assurance of a man who had encountered 1,000 puzzles, yet always believed that there was something new to learn from every case. His sharp eyes took in the scene with practiced ease, detecting the smallest of details, noting the reactions of the gathered guests, and assessing the atmosphere with a cool detachment that had made him one of the finest detectives in the force. He nodded briefly to Miss Marple, acknowledging her presence as a trusted observer, before stepping into the music room where Sir Reginald Ashworth's body lay in an unnerving stillness. The sight of Sir Reginald's lifeless form, slumped forward at the piano, struck Craddock immediately. He, like Miss Marple, knew there was something wrong about the scene. Sir Reginald's posture was too perfect, his fingers still resting lightly on the keys, and his head was bent forward at an unnatural angle, his final expression one of shock. Craddock's eyes immediately flicked to the neck. Dark bruising was beginning to form around Sir Reginald's throat, faint but unmistakable. Without a word, Craddock turned to his sergeant. "Get Dr. Whittaker here." "Now," he ordered. Then, his voice became more resolute, his suspicion hardening into certainty. This wasn't natural causes. This man was strangled. A collective gasp escaped the group gathered at the doorway. The sound of it seemed to reverberate through the room, as each of them, though perhaps in different ways, came to terms with the revelation. Miss Marple, however, remained unfazed. She had suspected as much from the moment she had seen the body. Craddock straightened up, taking in the room. "Strangled," he murmured again, as if testing the word in his mind. But no signs of a struggle. How very curious. He turned to the group. "Now then, I'll need to speak with each of you. One of you knows more than you're saying." The investigation began immediately, and Craddock's first stop was the drawing room, where the guests had gathered in a tight, uneasy cluster. The room was a cacophony of suppressed emotions, each person was clearly trying to maintain their composure, but their discomfort was palpable. Craddock began his questioning with Lady Ashworth, whose cool exterior gave little away. Lady Ashworth sat near the fireplace, her face stoic, but her eyes gleamed with a certain hardness that Miss Marple had noticed earlier. When Craddock asked her about her relationship with her late husband, her response was blunt. "I despised him," she said flatly, without hesitation. There was a murmur of surprise in the room, and even Miss Marple was momentarily taken aback. Henry Ashworth, however, merely folded his arms, a faint smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, as though this admission were not new information to him. Lady Ashworth continued, her voice steady. "Reginald was a cruel man. He enjoyed controlling everything, me, this house, every aspect of life. I stayed with him out of obligation, because that's what society expects, but I will not pretend I mourn him. I am relieved he is gone." Craddock regarded her with interest. "Where were you at the time of your husband's death?" "In the drawing room." "Ask anyone," she replied sharply. Craddock did just that, and while Lady Ashworth's alibi was confirmed by the other guests, it was far from exonerating. There was a certain coldness in her tone, one that hinted at deeper resentments than a simple marriage gone wrong. Next, Craddock turned his attention to Henry Ashworth. The young man was visibly agitated, his body language stiff, his fingers tapping an erratic rhythm against the armrest of his chair. Craddock knew instinctively that Henry was hiding something, though what exactly, he couldn't yet say. "I won't pretend I got along with my uncle," Henry admitted. "But I certainly didn't kill him." Craddock studied him closely. "Did you know your uncle was changing his will?" A flash of something crossed Henry's face. Guilt, perhaps? A flicker of irritation? Whatever it was quickly masked. "Yes," Henry said after a long pause. "I found out earlier tonight." "And you weren't happy about it?" "Would you be?" Henry snapped. "I've been waiting for that inheritance my entire life, and now he decides to change things?" "Of course I was furious, but that doesn't mean I killed him." He stopped himself, exhaling sharply, as though realizing he had revealed too much. Miss Marple noted the flicker of emotion that passed through Henry's eyes as he spoke. His anger was genuine, but there was something about his reaction that didn't quite ring true. Craddock didn't press him further, instead moving on to Mr. Weston, the solicitor. The man seemed more nervous with every passing moment, his hands fidgeting with his cuffs, his eyes darting toward the door as though wishing he were anywhere but here. "Yes," Weston finally admitted, his voice quivering slightly. "So Reginald did indeed intend to revise his will. But the final version had not yet been signed. And who stood to benefit from the new will?" Craddock asked, his voice steely. Weston hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "I'm not at liberty to discuss such matters," he replied stiffly. Craddock leaned forward. "Your client is dead. You can either tell me now, or I'll find out through other means." After a tense silence, Weston finally relented. His secretary, Mr. Graves. He was to be the new primary beneficiary. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Oliver Graves, who stood near the edge of the group, his face unreadable. Graves was the first to break the silence, his voice calm but firm. "That's not true. I had no idea about any changes to the will." Craddock raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "You expect me to believe that?" Graves's expression remained neutral. "I expect nothing, Inspector. I only deal in facts. And the fact is, I didn't kill Sir Reginald." Craddock's eyes bore into him, trying to read the man, to understand what was hidden behind that composed exterior. "Where were you at the time of death?" Craddock asked. "In my room," Graves replied, his voice even. "Alone." Craddock sighed inwardly. The alibi was flimsy at best. And yet, there was something about Graves's demeanor that made him difficult to read, an air of self-discipline that made the man hard to crack. As the questioning wound down, Craddock stood and addressed the room. "Sir Reginald Ashworth was murdered. Of that, I have no doubt. One of you knows more than you are saying." A tense silence followed, broken only by the distant sound of the clock ticking in the hall. The guests shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flitting between one another, but no one spoke. Craddock's gaze swept the room, locking eyes with each of them in turn. Miss Marple, ever the quiet observer, sipped her tea with a thoughtful expression. Her mind, however, was already working, knitting together the various threads of the case. She knew this wasn't just about the will or past grudges. There was something deeper at play, something that had yet to be uncovered. The tension in the room was palpable as Craddock took one last look at the group. He knew, as did Miss Marple, that the truth was hidden among the details. And it was only a matter of time before the full story came to light. Chapter 5: The Instrument of Deception. The drawing room at Ashworth Manor had grown uncomfortably cold despite the crackling fire in the hearth. The warmth of the flames did little to alleviate the tension that had settled heavily over the room. The guests, now assembled and awaiting their turn to be questioned by Inspector Craddock, were like chess pieces, each one moving in calculated silence, retreating into their own thoughts, possibly reflecting on their actions, or perhaps regretting them. Miss Marple, however, was not idle. While Craddock meticulously worked through the various statements and alibis, she quietly excused herself from the drawing room and, unnoticed by the others, made her way back to the music room. The room where Sir Reginald Ashworth had met his untimely end. As she entered, the grand piano stood like a monument to the man's life, its polished ebony surface gleaming softly under the dim light of a single candelabra. To the untrained eye, everything seemed perfectly in order, but Miss Marple was no stranger to the way small details could reveal great truths. Her sharp blue eyes scanned the room once more, taking in the elements others had either missed or dismissed. The torn sheet music scattered across the piano, the grand clock frozen at exactly 10 p.m., and then the piano itself. She had sat near it earlier in the evening, her gloved hands gently resting upon the keys. At the time, she had felt a strange sensation, subtle but unmistakable. A slight prick, like the brush of a needle against her skin, though she had dismissed it as a mere figment of her imagination. Now, however, with the silence of the room pressing down on her, the thought nagged at her. Miss Marple approached the piano, her fingers gliding over the keys with quiet reverence. She played the opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the very piece Sir Reginald had been performing when he died. The moment her fingers touched the keys, she felt it again, a faint, almost imperceptible sting beneath her fingertips. She paused, a flicker of realization crossing her mind. Was it possible that the sensation wasn't her imagination? Carefully, she pressed the key once more, applying a little more force. This time, the sting was distinct, a sharp, almost invisible prick. She withdrew her hand instantly, her mind already racing. Something was concealed within the piano. Something that had been designed to cause pain, unlikely, something far more sinister. Without hesitation, Miss Marple removed her gloves and leaned in closer to examine the piano's keys. The surface appeared pristine, the ivory shining in the candlelight, but as she gently ran her fingers along the keys, she detected something. A nearly imperceptible gap between one particular key and its wooden base, a space so small it might have been overlooked by anyone who wasn't looking for it. Reaching into her knitting bag, Miss Marple retrieved a long, slender hat pin, a tool that had always served her well in such situations. Carefully, she inserted the pin into the tiny gap, applying gentle pressure. A faint click echoed in the silence. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as a small sliver of metal, no longer than the tip of a sewing needle, emerged from the surface of the piano key, then swiftly retracted. Her lips parted in quiet approval. Quite ingenious, she murmured, her eye sparkling with the thrill of discovery. A hidden trap. A trap designed to pierce the skin when a specific key was pressed with sufficient force. And, Miss Marple suspected, the needle was coated with something far more lethal than mere poison. She stood up straight, her mind already racing with the implications. Sir Reginald's death had not been a simple case of strangulation as Craddock had initially surmised. No, Sir Reginald had died through the very instrument he cherished, the piano. The killer had rigged the keys with a needle, knowing Sir Reginald's routine so well that they could predict exactly when he would play the nocturne, striking the same keys every night with precision. All it had taken was a single press of the key, and the poison had done the rest. The method of murder was as elegant as it was cold-blooded. There had been no struggle, no confrontation. The killer had known Sir Reginald's habits intimately and had chosen the perfect moment for the deed, while he was lost in his music, unaware of the trap that awaited him. The piano, once an instrument of beauty, had been turned into a weapon. Miss Marple carefully retrieved a clean handkerchief from her bag. Using the hat pin, she gently pressed the tip of the needle against the fabric, then held it near the candle's flame. Within moments, a dark stain spread across the cloth, a clear sign of a fast-acting toxin, one that would have caused Sir Reginald to fall into immediate shock. The poison, Miss Marple knew, was designed to kill quickly and silently. She sat back in the dimly lit room, her mind working with methodical precision. The killer had set a very particular trap, which meant they had to know Sir Reginald's routine down to the finest detail. They had used his own habits against him. Few people had access to the music room, fewer still would have the knowledge and the patience to craft such an intricate and lethal mechanism. The prime suspects, she realized, had already presented themselves, each with their own motive. Lady Ashworth, who had openly admitted to despising her husband. She had no love for him, and his death could be seen as a release. But had she the patience and the technical knowledge to execute such a complicated plan? Henry Ashworth, who had learned that he was to be written out of the will, likely felt betrayed and angry. Could his frustration have driven him to kill? And yet, was it possible for a man so openly agitated to pull off such a quiet, subtle method of murder? Bernard Hale, a man who had spent years harboring resentment towards Sir Reginald. A musician whose own career had been overshadowed by Sir Reginald's success, was this a man capable of murder? Did his deep bitterness reach the point of taking Sir Reginald's life, or had the years of rivalry simply made him indifferent to the idea? Mr. Weston, the solicitor, who knew about the new will and the changes that it would bring. His knowledge of Sir Reginald's finances and the future heir should have made him a target for suspicion. But was it really enough to drive him to murder? And finally, Oliver Graves, the secretary, who had been named as the primary beneficiary in the new will. Graves was the least emotional of them all, a man who spoke little and revealed even less. His calm demeanor in the face of such a shocking death made him both an unlikely and a potentially very dangerous suspect. Had he known his time had come, and had he used his access to the piano to execute his plan? Each of these individuals had a clear motive. Each could have been capable of murder, but only one had the technical ability, the patience, and the knowledge of Sir Reginald's routines to craft such a deadly trap. Miss Marple stood and walked back to the door of the music room, her mind already piecing together the puzzle. She had everything she needed now. The killer had underestimated her ability to see through their deception, but they had made one fatal mistake, underestimating her attention to detail. Her gaze swept over the room one last time before she turned to face the door. The stage had been set. The only thing left was for the guilty party to reveal themselves. As she walked back to the drawing room, she knew it wouldn't be long before the truth came to light. The game had begun, and Miss Marple was always the one who would win. Chapter 6: The Web of Retribution. The discovery of the poisoned needle had confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected all along. The murder of Sir Reginald Ashworth was not the result of a spur-of-the-moment fit of passion or a hasty act of violence. No, it was a crime of meticulous planning, executed with a chilling sense of precision. The killer had known Sir Reginald's habits inside and out, relying on his rigid routine to ensure the success of their plot. They had not acted in the heat of anger or driven by a fleeting desire for wealth or status. This murder was a carefully crafted plan that had allowed fate to do much of the work. It was a crime born not of immediate desire, but of long-held hatred. As Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing room, her knitting needles moving methodically, her mind worked tirelessly to untangle the web of this complex case. The rhythmic clicking of the needles was a distraction to everyone else, but for Miss Marple, it was the sound of order emerging from chaos. With every stitch she made, the pieces of the puzzle slowly came together. She had been observing the others since the beginning, but there was one figure who had stood out more than the rest: Oliver Graves. Unlike the others, Graves had remained largely unmoved by the events around him. While the others fidgeted or spoke nervously, he sat apart from them, watching with quiet detachment. There was no sign of nervousness, no hint of guilt in his manner, or just a cold, composed calm. It was the kind of demeanor one might expect from a man who had already reconciled with the actions he had taken. Miss Marple's fingers tightened briefly around the knitting needles as a thought crossed her mind. She had seen men like Oliver before, men who had spent years patiently biding their time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As always, Miss Marple was never content to simply observe; she acted upon her instincts. With a quiet word to Inspector Craddock, she subtly directed the course of the investigation down a path that had been overlooked by the authorities. Craddock, always open to Miss Marple's insights, agreed to pursue her suggestion. It didn't take long for the truth to emerge, though not in the way anyone had expected. Years before Oliver Graves had entered Sir Reginald's service, another man had held the very same position, the position now occupied by Oliver's son. His name was Albert Graves, Oliver's father. Albert had been a trusted assistant to Sir Reginald for over a decade. Quiet and diligent, he had been the very image of a faithful servant. Yet one day, without warning or explanation, Sir Reginald had dismissed him. The official reason? A financial discrepancy, an unaccounted sum of money. Sir Reginald, known for his swift and ruthless judgment, had not cared for excuses, nor had he made room for investigation or due process. The accusation alone had been enough for Sir Reginald to cast Albert Graves aside. The man's life was ruined. His reputation shattered in a single, unforgiving stroke. Albert Graves, disgraced and humiliated, never again found respectable employment. His health deteriorated rapidly, and within a few years, he was dead, his life destroyed by the whim of a powerful man. Miss Marple, sitting in her chair, momentarily set aside her knitting. The image of Albert Graves's downfall was familiar to her, a man of integrity destroyed by the callousness of the powerful, and the injustices they wrought with impunity. She could almost hear the echoes of his despair. But what followed next was far more telling. Albert's son, Oliver Graves, had returned to Ashworth Manor years later, not as an avenger, but as a man who knew his place in the world. He had entered Sir Reginald's employ in the very same position his father had held, and he had waited, biding his time, gaining Sir Reginald's trust, all the while waiting for the opportunity to exact his quiet revenge. He had played the long game. Oliver had never been rash, never made his resentment known. He had patiently waited until the right moment arrived. And when it did, he had been ready to take the life of the man who had ruined his father's future. Miss Marple's gaze shifted toward Oliver Graves, who was seated in the corner of the room. His expression was as unreadable as ever, a calm facade hiding the storm of emotions that surely churned beneath the surface. He didn't appear as nervous as the others. If anything, he seemed almost detached, as though the death of Sir Reginald meant little to him beyond the satisfaction of a long-awaited reckoning. Had he expected someone to uncover the truth? Or had he truly believed that his crime had been so flawlessly executed that it would never be discovered? Miss Marple wondered whether Oliver had anticipated being exposed, or if, like many who commit crimes of long-standing revenge, he believed that time and his own patience would conceal his actions. As she watched the others, she noted their responses: Lady Ashworth's bitterness, Henry's frustration, Bernard Hale's cynicism, and Weston's nervousness. Each of them had a motive, but none of them seemed capable of such a long, patient wait for retribution. None of them had suffered the same kind of loss that Oliver Graves had endured, nor had any of them been willing to spend years plotting the perfect moment to strike. No, the true mastermind behind Sir Reginald's murder was Oliver Graves, a man who had quietly, methodically, built his entire life around the singular goal of exacting revenge on the man who had destroyed his father's life. The others had motives, but none had the depth of resolve required to endure the years of waiting. None had the patience to craft such an elaborate plan, to ensure that the trap would snap shut when the time was right. Revenge, Miss Marple knew, was an old game, one as old as time itself. It was a game not often won by the impatient, but by those who understood the power of waiting. Oliver Graves had been patient, and in that patience, he had crafted a perfect crime. Miss Marple took a sip of her tea, allowing herself a small, knowing smile. She had seen it all before, the quiet, obsessive need for revenge, the patient plotting, and the eventual downfall of those who believe themselves untouchable. As she set her teacup down with a delicate clink, she knew that she had everything she needed to unmask the killer. It was only a matter of time before Oliver Graves's past caught up with him. The web of lies and deception had been unraveled, and the truth was now clear. Miss Marple had solved the puzzle. The only task remaining was to bring it to light, to watch as the guilty party was exposed for all to see. And as she sat back in her chair, her mind already turning toward her next move, she knew that the game was nearing its end. The truth had a way of revealing itself, and the guilty party would soon be forced to face the consequences of their actions. Chapter 7: The Final Revelation. The music room at Ashworth Manor had never felt so heavy. The room that had once echoed with the sounds of Sir Reginald's music now stood in solemn silence, a silent witness to the crime that had taken place within its walls. The grand piano, still polished to perfection, loomed in the center of the room, its keys now holding a darker significance. The once lively and vibrant space, filled with the sounds of Sir Reginald's performances, now felt like a tomb. The guests, and now suspects, had gathered, summoned by Miss Marple at the quiet request of Inspector Craddock. One by one, they entered the room, each carrying the weight of the previous night's tragic events. Lady Ashworth, regal yet stiff, took a seat on one of the velvet-backed chairs, her hands neatly folded in her lap. Henry Ashworth stood near the grand fireplace, his arms crossed and his eyes dark with frustration. Bernard Hale, ever the brooding figure, wandered near the bookshelves, running his fingers over the spines of the volumes, searching for any distraction. Mr. Weston, the solicitor, stood by the door, his usual nervousness more pronounced than ever. And then there was Oliver Graves, the last to enter, as expected. His quiet presence seemed almost too calm, too composed. He made his way to the corner of the room, his face a mask of indifference. Inspector Craddock stood nearby, but it was clear that Miss Marple would take the lead. She had asked for this moment, and now she would reveal the truth. Miss Marple did not raise her voice. She had never needed to. With calm precision, she began, her keen blue eyes scanning the room. It was a most unusual murder, she began, her voice steady. Elegant, in its own way. Ingenious. And, I dare say, long in the making. She moved toward the piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. Sir Reginald, as we all knew, was a man of habit. Every evening, he played this piano. And every evening, he played the same nocturne, a piece so familiar to him that he barely needed to glance at the keys. Miss Marple paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. The guests shifted in their seats, unease creeping through their expressions. And someone here knew that, she continued, her voice calm but cutting. A ripple of tension swept through the room. The method was clever, Miss Marple went on. A tiny, spring-loaded needle, hidden within a particular key, one Sir Reginald struck with force every night. It emerged just long enough to pierce his skin. Such a small thing. So quick! But enough to deliver a fatal dose of poison. Henry Ashworth's breath caught, and he exhaled sharply. Poison? He asked, his voice edged with disbelief. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes never leaving him. A fast-acting toxin. A substance that would cause near-instantaneous paralysis. A victim would slump forward, unable to call for help, appearing as though they had simply stopped. She glanced toward the grand hall clock, which had stopped at exactly 10 p.m. And then there is this. The clock stopped at precisely 10 o'clock. A deliberate attempt to fix the time of death to ensure an alibi. Turning back to face the group, Miss Marple's gaze swept across each of them. It was a crime of patience. A crime of planning. And it was committed by someone with access to this piano. Someone who had reason to hate Sir Reginald and yet someone he trusted implicitly. She allowed the silence to settle for a moment before she spoke the name that would shatter the quiet. Mr. Oliver Graves. The room fell into complete silence. There was no outburst, no dramatic protest. Oliver Graves, who had remained composed throughout the entire investigation, did not so much as flinch. Instead, he regarded Miss Marple with a faint, almost amused curiosity. "And what leads you to that conclusion, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Miss Marple smiled, almost kindly. "The truth, Oliver, is that you were never a suspect at first. You were too invisible. And that, you see, was your strength. You made yourself indispensable to Sir Reginald, just as your father once did. You were the quiet observer, the loyal secretary, the man no one ever looked at twice." A flicker of something, was it amusement, crossed Oliver's face. Miss Marple continued, "But when I discovered how Sir Reginald was killed, I had to ask myself, who would take the time to construct such a trap? Who had access to the piano long enough to alter it without detection? Who had the knowledge to select a poison that would kill without struggle?" She folded her hands in her lap. "The answer, of course, was you. And then I learned about your father." The room seemed to shrink as the weight of her words settled in. Inspector Craddock cleared his throat, his voice steady. "We made inquiries, Mr. Graves. We know that your father was dismissed from Sir Reginald's service. We know he was disgraced, falsely accused of a financial discrepancy. We know that his life was ruined because of Sir Reginald's swift judgment. And we know that you returned here years later, under a different name, with one clear purpose." For the first time, Oliver Graves showed a reaction. His lips parted slightly, the mask of composure faltering for just a moment. Miss Marple regarded him gently, her voice soft. "You waited, didn't you? Years of patience. Years of quiet resentment. And then, finally, you found the perfect way to strike back. A method your father, who had been so careful, so devoted, would have appreciated. Precision. Poise. A performance, if you will." Oliver inhaled deeply, his breath barely audible. For a moment, he was still, his eyes flickering with something that could have been admiration, or perhaps resignation. "You're very clever, Miss Marple," he murmured. "I should have known you would see it." He turned to face Inspector Craddock. "There's no need for a fuss. I'll come quietly. No denials. No cries of innocence. Just a quiet acceptance, a final acknowledgement of the truth." As the police moved to escort Oliver Graves from the room, he glanced one last time at the piano, his gaze lingering on the instrument that had been his accomplice. "It was a beautiful tune, wasn't it?" he said softly, almost wistfully. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said, her voice equally soft. But you must remember, Mr. Graves, that revenge, no matter how elegantly performed, is always a discordant note in the end." With that, Oliver Graves was led away, his footsteps echoing faintly in the room. The door clicked shut behind him, and the room fell into a deep silence. The guests, who once suspects, now simply witnesses, remained motionless, as though the revelation had drained the energy from them. The stillness was profound, broken only by the faint sound of a clock ticking in the distance. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her gaze lingering on the now empty music room. The case had come to an end, the threads of deception unraveled, and the truth had emerged, as it always did. But in the end, the truth was not always the sweet resolution one hoped for. Sometimes, it was merely the end of a song, an unfinished melody that would never play again. Chapter 8: The Unspoken Melody. A heavy silence descended upon Ashworth Manor as the police departed, the weight of the evening's event still hanging in the air like the final, unresolved note of a symphony. The house, once filled with tension and suspense, now seemed oddly still, as though the walls themselves were exhaling in relief. Lady Ashworth, who had remained composed throughout the ordeal, sat back in her chair and exhaled deeply. Her face, normally a mask of indifference, seemed to soften for the briefest moment as if a burden had been lifted. She adjusted the bracelet on her wrist, a gesture that seemed more reflexive than conscious, then spoke briskly, her voice devoid of emotion. "Well," she said, her tone even, "I suppose there will be matters to attend to. I shall leave the morning to those who feel inclined." Across the room, Henry Ashworth stood with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the fire, but there was a tension in his stance that hadn't been there before. He wasted no time, his voice cutting through the silence as he asked, "And the will?" Miss Marple observed him carefully. His voice was neutral, but beneath the surface, she detected a sharp undercurrent of eagerness. He had been waiting for this moment, uncertain of what the new will might hold. Mr. Weston, the solicitor, shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat as he fidgeted with the cuffs of his shirt. "The new will was never signed," he admitted, glancing around the room at the gathered guests. "The last executed version still stands." There was a pause, as the weight of this statement settled over the group. Then, Henry, who had seemed so tense throughout the evening, exhaled a quiet breath of relief. His shoulders relaxed, and the faintest glimmer of satisfaction passed through his eyes. He had expected to be cut out of his inheritance, but now, much to his surprise, it was his once again. Bernard Hale, standing near the bookshelves, chuckled softly as he poured himself another glass of brandy. "The old man spent his life controlling everything," he mused, his voice tinged with dry amusement. "Always dictating, always making sure the world bent to his will. And yet, the one thing he didn't finalize is the only thing that matters now." His words hung in the air, heavy with something more than mere amusement. There was satisfaction in his tone, but also something darker, a recognition of the irony of the situation. Miss Marple, who had remained silent throughout most of the conversation, rose from her chair. She had no interest in the will or the practicalities that followed. Her thoughts were elsewhere, swirling in a quiet current that had been building since her discovery in the music room. She wandered back to the room where Sir Reginald had met his tragic end, drawn by something she couldn't quite explain, a lingering connection to the man's final moments, to the instrument that had played a pivotal role in his death. The grand piano stood in the dim light, its ebony surface gleaming softly. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like just another piece of furniture in the room, an object of beauty and craftsmanship. But Miss Marple knew better. This piano had been an accomplice in murder just as surely as if it had been physically involved. She approached it with quiet reverence, her fingers lightly grazing the keys. She didn't play at first, merely tracing the familiar shapes with her fingertips, remembering how Sir Reginald had once filled this room with music. After a moment, she pressed down on the keys, letting the opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major drift through the room. The melody filled the space, soft and delicate, but there was something else there, a resonance of memory, of fate, and of a life now lost. It was the same tune that had lured Sir Reginald to his death, the same piece that had witnessed the end of his life. As she finished the phrase, footsteps echoed in the hallway, and Inspector Craddock appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a look of mild curiosity on his face. "I didn't take you for a pianist, Miss Marple," he remarked, his voice laced with an amused note. Miss Marple smiled softly, finishing the last few notes before lifting her hands from the piano. "Oh, I wouldn't claim to be one," she said with a touch of modesty. "But music is rather like human nature, don't you think? Patterns, habits, repetitions. And sometimes, hidden notes, things only the careful listener will ever notice." Craddock raised an eyebrow, folding his arms across his chest. "You knew it was Oliver Graves from the start, didn't you?" Miss Marple's smile remained, though there was a glint of something sharper in her eyes. "Not at first," she admitted. "But once I understood how Sir Reginald was killed, I had to ask myself, who would take the time to construct such a trap? Who had access to this piano for long enough to alter it without detection? And who had the knowledge to select a poison that would kill without struggle?" She paused, her gaze resting on the piano once more. "The answer, of course, was Oliver. And then I learned about his father." Craddock sighed, the frustration of the case now giving way to the solemnity of its resolution. "Revenge. A long time to wait for it," he said quietly. Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Yes. But revenge, Inspector, is never quite as sweet as people imagine." She pressed a single key, letting the sound linger in the air for a moment before continuing, "This piano never lied. It did precisely what it was meant to do. But people," she smiled ruefully, "people always do." Craddock chuckled softly, clearly both impressed and resigned. "Well, it's all wrapped up now. Thanks to you." Miss Marple gave a modest shrug, her eyes twinkling with quiet amusement. "Oh, it was all there to be seen, Inspector. One simply had to listen." She smoothed down her coat, her thoughts already turning back to the peaceful life she would soon return to. Glancing once more at the piano, she added, "It's time I returned to St. Mary Mead. Murder is all very well, but I find a little gardening and a quiet cup of tea far more satisfying." And with that, Miss Marple turned and left the room, her footsteps echoing softly against the wooden floors. As she passed through the door and out of Ashworth Manor, the faint sound of the piano's last note hung in the air, a lingering reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded and the truths that had been uncovered. For in the end, the melody had never lied. It was people, frail, imperfect people, who always did.